Daniel Pinkwater. Mrs. Noodlekugel and Four Blind Mice. Illustrated by Adam Stower. Chapter 1. Mrs. Noodlekugel's little house was in a sort of backyard behind a tall apartment building. The house was built long before the apartment buildings that had grown up all around it. Mrs. Noodlekugel lived with her cat, Mr. Fuzzface, and 4 fat mice. Nick and Maxine, a human boy and girl, brother and sister, lived in one of the apartment buildings. They discovered the hidden backyard and the little house, and Mrs. Noodlekugel, and became friends. Mrs. Noodlekugel also became the children's babysitter. They would visit her in the little house when their parents were away, and sometimes when they were not. Very often, they would have tea and cookies with Mrs. Noodlekugel, Mr. Fuzzface, and the mice. One day, the mice were making a terrible mess, spreading cookie crumbs everywhere, and spilling tea. "The mice are becoming very far-sighted," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "It is not that they have bad table manners, just that they do not see very well. There is nothing to do but take them downtown and have them fitted with eyeglasses." "I was thinking the same," said Mr. Fuzzface, Mrs. Noodlekugel's cat. "We will take them tomorrow," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "Children, would you like to come along? We will go on the bus. You can help us, and it will be interesting. You want us to come with you on the bus?" Nick and Maxine asked. "If you don't mind," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "Mr. Fuzzface has to go in a cat carrier. It is a rule of the bus company. I have such a cat carrier. I will ask Mike the janitor to get it from the attic. Then you children could help me carry him." Mike the janitor mopped the floors and carried out the garbage and fixed things around the apartment building. Sometimes he also helped Mrs. Noodlekugel. Nick and Maxine knew him. He had a blue chin and a mustache like a brush, and liked to sit in a little room in the basement, eating stewed tomatoes out of a can, talking to himself and listening to the radio. "We will have to ask our parents," Nick and Maxine said. "I am sure they will agree," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "It is a perfectly respectable bus company." Chapter 2. Nick and Maxine turned up at Mrs. Noodlekugel's house in the morning with a note from their parents saying they could go. Mrs. Noodlekugel had on her coat and a hat with flowers and plastic cherries. She was trying to coax Mr. Fuzzface into a cat carrier, which was like a big handbag with a little screened window. "It is wrong to make me ride in that thing," Mr. Fuzzface said. "It is only for a little while," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "And it is a rule of the bus company." "I object to being treated like an animal," Mr. Fuzzface said. "I understand," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "It is undignified," Mr. Fuzzface said. "It is," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "I protest," Mr. Fuzzface said. "But you want to come along," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "You want to come downtown with the children and the mice and me, do you not?" "Yes. And you want to visit the oculist, so the mice can be fitted with eyeglasses, and afterward we will go and have something nice to eat. You would like that, wouldn't you? May I order anything I want?" Mr. Fuzzface asked. "Of course," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "Ice cream and sardines?" Mr. Fuzzface asked. "Do if you want," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "I will ride in the cat carrier," Mr. Fuzzface said. "But it is wrong. It is this way every time we go anywhere," Mrs. Noodlekugel said to Nick and Maxine. "But where are the mice?" Nick asked. "Oh, I did not forget the mice," Mrs. Noodlekugel said. "Look closely at my hat." Nick and Maxine looked closely at Mrs. Noodlekugel's hat. Among the plastic cherries and flowers, the 4 mice were attached to the hat by elastic bands around their middles. They are quite safe and secure, Mrs. Noodlekugel said.